An important thing to understand is that the ways in which we see the world affect the ways in which we interact with the world. A very important concept to learn is something called bias. I want you to remember a time where you got a new pair of shoes or you bought a new car. All of a sudden, you may have noticed that pair of shoes or that car driving everywhere or walking everywhere. And it's not that there are more shoes or more cars, but rather that you are aware of that and you are looking specifically for that in the world. In a very strange way, that is the way our minds operate. Once we become aware of something or unaware of something, it's as if that piece does not exist. In diversity, often we have developed biases that we are not aware of. And what I'm going to do in this specific session is talk a little bit about anti-bias or recognizing one's bias. I'm going to begin by talking about personal and social barriers to success in an organization related to diversity. I've identified 6 main ones. The first one is stereotypes. The second one is limited perceptions, ethnocentrism, prejudice plus power, prejudice, and discrimination. When we understand the ways in which these 6 pieces operate in an organization, we can begin to identify ways to mitigate these, and the result of that is an increased productivity, an increased retention rate in your organization, and most importantly, people feel part of the organizational culture in an inclusive way. Let's talk about each of these. So the first one is a stereotype. A stereotype is an unfair, oversimplified, generalized perception of a group. I used this particular picture over here because what it does is it's a very good example of how movies and radio have stereotyped specifically white women to look, act, and behave in certain ways. If we think about the fact that young children watch Disney movies that show damsels in distress, for example, and then we think about the ways in which women are sometimes seen as helpless, we notice that there are stereotypes that are built around those specific things. This can happen for individual groups, and it can happen for large groups. We see this in the ways in which people characterize gangsters and thugs, for example, and those terms are used as stereotypes for specific racial groups. We see the ways in which the words terrorists are used for certain groups and not for others. These are stereotypes, and they are very, very harmful and very, very permanent in most organizations. And the important thing to do is to figure out what stereotypes are at play. One of the ways you can do that is to look at the organizational chart and look at where, for example, women are in that organizational chart and what roles they play. A very stereotypical role for a woman is an administrative role, and a very stereotypical role for a man is in a role of power. And so if you look at your organizational chart and you find that all the secretaries and administrative staff are women and all the people in power are men, there may be something about stereotypes at play that you need to look at. The next one is limited perceptions. What we see is our reality. Okay, let me explain that very quickly. When you're looking at the world, there are multiple options for you to see and for you to experience. However, the human brain has helped us limit our perception so that we only look at things that we think matter to us. And so if you bought a purple car, all of a sudden you would notice purple cars everywhere. However, perhaps a year earlier, when a purple car was not even on your mind, you would never have noticed a purple car passing you. So when we limit our perceptions, we can also do this with people. When we have certain people in our minds that we acknowledge and think about, and often those people are very similar to us. And so we begin to create a community of people that are very similar to us, and our mind filters out people that are different to us. And that's what limited perceptions is. Very, very important to understand. The next important barrier to success is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the belief that because we are who we are, we are naturally better than others. So for example, a good phrase to capture this is, we are not perfect, but our culture is superior to others. So ethnocentrism, coming from the word ethnic and the word center, right? Putting your ethnicity at the center of what you do. Ethnocentrism is a way of people feeling a sense of not necessarily pride in their identity, right? That's important. But feeling that that identity is superior in ways compared to other people's identities. And that's where ethnocentrism can become a problem. We think about words like nationalism. We think about words like racialism, right? These are ways in which people have adopted race and nationalism to feel superior to others, right? Very important term that plays out often in workplaces. The next term is prejudice. And if you have a pen and paper, make sure you write these down, right? Prejudice is an irrational and inflexible opinion formed on the basis of a limited and insufficient knowledge, right? Important. Prejudice is in your mind. Okay? Prejudice is the ways in which we look at something and form an opinion on that something, right? And it leads to inaccurate judgments of people, becomes a source of distraction, results in resentment and fear, and impacts one's health. When we think negatively about someone or something, we develop a prejudice for that, and that prejudice can have impacts both on the way we think and on the way we act. Talking about act, there's prejudice where you can just look at someone on the street and think something of them. However, when you're in a position of power, that can increase the harmful impact of those prejudices. So, for example, if you're walking on the street, you see someone and you have a prejudicial attitude towards them, that does not necessarily have a direct impact on that person. However, if you're a bus driver and you deny someone that opportunity to get on the bus based on your prejudice because you have power, in other words, you're riding the bus, this is when prejudice takes a new level, right? Because you have a position of power, you're able to use that power to reinforce your prejudice. So let me talk a little bit about isms, right? So this is where racism, xenophobia, homophobia, all the isms that we have come into play, where people with power begin to use that power to reinforce their prejudice, right? And that's a really, really important thing. So prejudice is in the mind, but it can also exist in the body, in the physical form. So we see this when managers are using their biases against women and others, and their position of power to reinforce the stereotypes, for example. And finally, we have discrimination. Discrimination is the denial of rights, okay? Now, not letting that person get on the bus is a denial of their right. So prejudice and power, right? That they could put a lawsuit forward, and they could probably win a lawsuit based on the fact that they were discriminated against. The difference between prejudice and discrimination is discrimination allows you to actually open up a court case, right? You can use the court system. However, prejudice is not always a very cut and dried legal matter. Prejudice can happen in a store when you're walking and you can see someone, for example, make a slight remark, or a store owner not serve a particular customer. That's prejudice, right? It's hard to prove that as discrimination. It's prejudice. Plus power in many instances, but discrimination are clear-cut ways in which people are denied rights, human rights, based on whatever identity marker they have, whether they have black, brown skin, whether they have a certain religion, whether they are a certain ethnicity. All these kind of pieces play into discrimination and prejudice. So those are the 6 barriers to success. Identifying those barriers, identifying the way that they play out in your organization will increase your awareness and understanding the ways in which your biases could play in to both prejudice, power, and discrimination.